The grand hall of Valmoria trembled with music and laughter. The scent of roasted meats and sweet wine filled the air as nobles, aristocrats, and esteemed guests danced beneath the flickering light of golden lanterns. Tonight was a night of celebration, a night to honor the return of Prince Edward Wycliffe, the long-awaited heir to the throne. King Charles Wycliffe, a man of stern presence and unyielding rule, sat proudly upon his grand seat, his eyes watching over the revelry with satisfaction, his beautiful wife right next to him, his queen. His son had returned from years of travel and study, bearing the wisdom of distant lands, ready to assume his rightful place. And as part of securing the future of the kingdom, he had chosen a bride for his son, Lady Eleanor Hawthorne, the daughter of one of the most powerful aristocratic families in Valmoria. Eleanor was the very image of nobility, poised, graceful, and adorned in the finest silk gown that shimmered under lamplights. She was beautiful, envied by many, and yet her intended groom barely acknowledged her presence. Edward remained distant, his thoughts elsewhere, drowning in the heavy weight of expectations. Since his arrival, he had felt like a stranger in his own homeland. Valmoria had not changed, but he had. The kingdom operated like a well-oiled machine. Every tradition followed without question, every rule obeyed without complaint. But Edward had seen the world. He had ridden through the great deserts, sailed the roaring seas, walked through cities where men were free to forge their own paths. And now, after tasting the freedom of adventure, he could not bear the thought of being shackled to a throne, bound by customs he did not believe in. The celebration continued into the deep hours of the night, but Edward was barely present in mind. He endured the stares of noble women, the murmured expectations of ministers, and most of all, the suffocating presence of Eleanor. She clung to him like ivy on stone, smiling sweetly but with cold calculation in her eyes. She had noticed his reluctance, his lack of desire for her, and she had no intention of letting her future slip away. If Edward would not give himself to her willingly, she would take matters into her own hands. A servant girl in royal maid's uniform comes to serve the prince more wine, and Eleanor stares at it with attention. A rare potion, known to arouse a man's deepest urges, swirled within the deep red wine. If he succumbed to desire, if their union was sealed in the dark secrecy of the night, he would have no choice but to marry her. Edward took the goblet without suspicion. He had been drinking all evening, drowning his thoughts in wine, and this was no different. As he swallowed, the familiar warmth spread through him. He kept drinking, and Eleanor looked so pleased as she watched him drink the wine. Soon, Edward's vision starts to blur, his mind hazy. The voices around him became distant murmurs, the flickering lights an unbearable blur. Something was wrong. His heart pounded in his chest, sweat clinging to his brow. Was he merely drunk? Had he taken too much? No, this was different. A heaviness settled over him, pulling him under. He needed to slip out. Pushing through the crowd, he steadied himself, forcing a composed expression. He could not collapse here, not before the eyes of his father, the nobles, and most of all, Eleanor. They would never let him leave if they sensed his weakness. Murmuring an excuse about the need for fresh air, he slipped away unnoticed by most, except for Eleanor, who watched him with a smirk. She had set the trap. Now, she only needed to wait. The night air struck his skin as he stumbled into the darkness, leaving the open palace grounds behind. He did not return to the king's palace. Instead, he veered in the opposite direction. His vision swayed, but he pushed forward, deeper into the silent shadows of Valmoria's outer gardens. He had to clear his mind. He had to think. The night was dark and silent, save for the faint rustling of leaves and the distant hum of the palace's festivities. In the heart of Valmoria's royal gardens, Matilda sits in the small shelter, in the dark, cold room. The air around her was thick with the aroma of fresh herbal spices and vegetables, the very plants she tended to all day, but the warmth of the day had long since faded. Now it was only the cold and silence that embraced her. Though it was a great honor to work in the gardens of the king's palace, Matilda knew that she was not truly part of the palace. She was no more than a lowly peasant, only here to work for free. The workers around her received all the benefits and payments and handouts. Matilda received none of that. She was simply a shadow in the corners, unnoticed and unacknowledged, with no name listed among the kingdom's workers. Tonight, the palace was alive with music and laughter as the kingdom celebrated the return of Prince Edward Wycliffe. Matilda had heard the sounds from her small shelter, but could not join in the merrymaking. All the palace gardens workers were requested to help at the party, which is a great honor, so her auntie forced her to spend the night at the garden shelter instead, as they rest go and have fun. Her aunt would be furious if she returns home, and the palace had made it clear that common peasants were not allowed to set foot near the celebration grounds, something she has no identity in this kingdom. Only servers that help and those helping at running the events and serving the guests are allowed at the party, only to work, yet they need to be identified workers. In all the years she has spent in this kingdom, her aunt has never sought out the option of getting her registered as a citizen. She would rather have Matilda be treated as a stranger. So, Matilda sat alone in the small, dark shelter, her thoughts heavy with the night's isolation. She decided to step outside for some air, careful to remain unseen. Her aunt hand warned her to stay hidden. She knew she was not welcome in the open spaces where the nobility danced and celebrated, but perhaps the cool air in the gardens would clear her mind. She crept from the shelter, moving through the garden's shadows, where the moonlight barely reached. Her feet were silent on the soft earth, and her breath came quietly as she tiptoed along the edge of the garden. But then, amidst the stillness, she heard something. A sound low and labored, like a man struggling. Her heart skipped. Quickly, Matilda hid behind a large rose bush, careful not to be seen. She watched, her eyes narrowing to the dark figure stumbling in the distance. It was a man, she realized. And judging by his gait and the sounds he made, he was in pain. Matilda's first instinct was to stay hidden and leave him to his misery. After all, she was a peasant. No one would help her if something went wrong. In this palace, no one cared for the likes of her. But the man continued to struggle, his large form stumbling and swaying. He looked like he was about to fall. Matilda's conscience stirred. Despite her fear, despite the warning bells in her mind, she could not stand by and do nothing. She pushed her doubts aside and, gathering all the courage she had, stepped out of the shadows. The man's body dropped to the ground with a heavy thud. He groaned in pain, and Matilda rushed to his side, heart pounding in her chest. She knelt beside him, feeling his warm breath against her hands as she tried to help him up. As she grasped his arm and heaved, she could smell a rich perfume on him. His clothes were made of fine fabric, and a royal emblem caught her eye, tucked into the folds of his tunic. Her heart sank as recognition hit her. This man is a noble. A prince, she realized, and panic immediately set in. Matilda was no stranger to the rigid class divide in Valmoria, and she knew well enough that peasants like her had no business touching nobility. She could be punished for just being seen with him, let alone touching him. Her mind raced, trying to think of a way out of this dangerous situation. She needed to get away from him before anyone discovered her. She tapped him gently on the shoulder, trying to rouse him from his stupor. His eyes fluttered open, but his gaze was unfocused. Matilda froze when she saw his face clearly for the first time. His features were striking, familiar, though she could not place where she had seen him before. She glanced down and spotted the royal crown, discarded carelessly in the grass beside him, confirming her worst fears. If anyone found her here, with the Prince of Valmoria, she would be finished. Her aunt would certainly kill her, and worse, the palace guards would have no mercy on a peasant girl caught in such a compromising position. She would be cast out, perhaps even worse. She had to act quickly. Matilda's eyes darted towards the king's palace, but it was no use. The guards posted at the celebration grounds were far too many, and the thought of trying to explain herself to any of them filled her with dread. The best she could hope for was to get help without being caught. Then, an idea struck her. The prince's private residence on the opposite side was less guarded than the main royal halls, and it's nearer too. If she could get the prince there, she might find someone who could help him. She could slip away before anyone noticed, and no one would be the wiser. But the road to the private residence was not without its dangers, so she left the prince and rushed to look out for any dangers. Matilda crept closer to the prince's private palace, heart pounding in her chest. She stayed low to the ground, blending into the shadows as best as she could. By the time she reached the edge of the property, she could see a few guards, their postures slack and their laughter echoing in the air. They were too drunk to be of much use. She dared not approach them directly. Her thoughts shifted to Henry, the palace guard who had taken a peculiar interest in her. He was not here tonight, but his friends, loud and boisterous, were all too familiar with her. Henry is high in command among the guards, and his father is the king's personal right-hand man. Henry had been after Matilda for a very long time now, and his intentions for her are clearly sinister, and she feared that his friends might alert him to her presence. It will be dreaded if he finds out she is all on her own in the shelter at this hour. Matilda quickly turned her attention back to the back entrance. It was unguarded, a door leading directly into the prince's quarters. If she could just get the prince there, she would disappear into the night. Matilda's breath was ragged as she returned back to where the prince lay, still struggling on the ground. His face was twisted in pain, and no part of her wanted to leave him, something in her heart could not. She knelt again, feeling sorry for him. She gently grasped his arm, lifting him with more care this time. There was no turning back now. With the prince leaning on her, Matilda began to move slowly through the buses toward the back entrance of his private palace, praying that she could get him the help he so desperately needed, and praying that she could escape without being caught. The night was still as Matilda struggled to bring the prince into his palace. It was no easy task. He was far too heavy, and though he could walk, he leaned on her completely, causing them to stumble and fall more than once. The drunken chatter of the guards echoed from a distance, their laughter and slurred words blending into the night. Matilda's heart pounded in fear that one of them might wander too close and discover them. But luck was on her side. The back entrance to the prince's private palace had been left open. With great effort, she managed to drag him through the doorway, breathing a sigh of relief as the door closed behind them. She did not waste time searching for a proper chamber. The first door she found, she pushed open, leading them into a dimly lit bedroom. The prince was growing heavier by the second, and with one final effort, she hauled him onto the bed. But the weight of him dragged her down as well, and before she could steady herself, she tumbled onto the bed beside him. Matilda lay there for a few moments, exhausted. Her arms ached from supporting him, and her breath came in heavy gasps. The prince was much heavier than he had seemed in the gardens, and now that she was no longer moving, the strain of carrying him hit her all at once. She had barely gathered the strength to rise when she felt something firm and unyielding around her wrist. Her body froze. Slowly, she lifted her gaze, and for the first time, she truly saw him. The candlelight flickered, casting shadows over his features, but it did not hide the intensity in his eyes. The weak, stumbling man she had helped was gone. In his place was a prince who looked fierce, powerful, and dangerous. His breath was heavy, his chest rising and falling like a beast that had been wounded, but was still strong enough to fight. Matilda's throat tightened. Fear gripped her as she quickly tried to explain herself. "Your Highness, I was only helping," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean no harm. I shall leave now. Please, please forgive me." She tried to pull away, but his grip only tightened. Her heart raced as she struggled, but he was far stronger. In one swift movement, he shifted, and Matilda suddenly found herself trapped beneath him. The moment that followed was filled with a piercing scream, loud enough to shake the very walls. The drunken guards outside halted their revelry, their muddled senses slowly registering that something was amiss. Realizing that someone must have entered into the prince's palace unnoticed, they rushed toward the building, their boots pounding against the stone. Inside, the screams continued, leading them directly to the chamber. Without hesitation, they burst through the door, ready to strike down any intruder. But the sight before them made them freeze in place. The prince was there, and a maiden was with him. Though she wept bitterly, there was nothing they could do. They had sworn loyalty to the royal family above all else. Without a word, they stepped back and left the room, closing the door behind them. Matilda cried for hours, her heart heavy with sorrow. When the prince finally released her, she was drained of all strength. Every part of her ached, and she felt as though she had nothing left inside her. Her mind spun with regret. She had always been careful, always avoided danger. She had done everything to protect herself, and yet, fate had been cruel. She was already a lowly peasant, an orphan with no family name to give her standing. Now, she had lost the only thing that truly belonged to her, her dignity. Would any man ever look at her as a woman worthy of respect? Would she ever be anything more than a forgotten shadow in this great kingdom? Her legs trembled as she forced herself to stand, but the pain was unbearable. She bit her lip, determined not to let it break her. Somehow, she managed to leave the chamber, one slow step at a time. The journey back to the small shelter in the gardens felt endless. By the time she reached it, her body gave out, and she collapsed onto the rough straw mat inside. And then, she wept for the rest of the night. The late morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting golden light upon the grand chamber. The air was still, save for the soft rustling of the curtains. Prince Edward stirred beneath the silk sheets, his head pounding with an unbearable weight. A deep groan escaped his lips as he pressed his fingers against his temples, trying to soothe the fiery pain that pulsed through his skull. His body felt drained, unusually heavy, as though he had fought in battle the previous night. Blinking hard, he struggled to recall the events that had led him here. He remembered the grand feast, the endless flow of wine, the laughter of nobles ringing in his ears. He had drunk more than he ought to, far more. He remembered feeling disoriented, his mind clouded, his steps unsteady. And then a voice, a maiden's voice, pleading, crying, shouting. Edward's breath hitched as the memory came rushing back like a crashing wave. His heart pounded as he suddenly sat up, his vision sharpening at the sight before him. The sheets, his sheets, were stained with blood. A cold chill swept over him. His gaze darted downward, realization dawning upon him in a sickening instant. He was bare beneath the covers, his body bearing signs of what had transpired the night before. He had lain with the woman. Worse still, he had deflowered her. And from the looks of it, it had not been gentle. His chest tightened with unease. He did not want to think of what might have happened here, but the proof lay before him, undeniable and damning. "Guards," he called urgently, his voice hoarse yet commanding. Within moments, 2 palace guards rushed into the chamber, bowing low before him. "Who was in my chamber last night?" Edward demanded, his voice laced with tension. "There was a woman, Your Majesty," one guard answered hesitantly. Edward clenched his jaw. He already knew that, but this only confirmed his fears. "How did she get in?" he pressed. The guards exchanged a nervous glance. If they admitted they had not seen her enter, it would reveal their negligence. The prince might then learn they had been drinking and neglecting their duties. One of them finally spoke, his voice careful. "My prince, you brought the maiden in yourself. That is why we allowed her entry." Edward gave a slow nod, processing their words. So she had not come here of her own will. He had brought her. "Where is she?" he asked, his tone sharp. "She left last night, my prince, after you fell asleep," the guard replied. Edward's hands balled into fists beneath the sheets. They had seen her leave, yet they had not stopped her. "Go and bring her to me at once," he ordered. The guard stiffened. Panic flickered in their eyes. They did not know who the maiden was. How could they possibly find her? Edward's patience thinned. "What are you waiting for?" he growled. "My prince, we shall find her immediately," one guard assured him hastily, then added in a quieter voice, "But may your majesty tell us the maiden's name?" Edward's brow furrowed. "You do not know her?" The guards lowered their heads, shame washing over them. "No, your highness." It was dark, we could not see her face clearly. A heavy silence settled in the room. This was a grave problem. Edward himself had no idea who she was. He had no memory of her face, only the haunting echoes of her cries. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his aching head. Then, with deep reluctance, he asked, "Be truthful with me. What happened between the maiden and I last night?" The guard stiffened but dared not disobey. One of them swallowed hard before speaking. "Your Highness, we saw you and the maiden together in this chamber." Edward's jaw tightened. "And you were having relations," the guard admitted carefully. Edward closed his eyes briefly, the weight of their words pressing upon him. He had expected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his stomach churn. But there was one question left. One dreadful, looming question. As we lay together, was she agreeable to it? The guards hesitated. A long silence stretched between them. Edward's sharp gaze bore into them. "Answer me," he commanded. The first guard swallowed hard before replying. "No, Your Majesty." The maiden did not seem willing. "She was crying, shouting, she struggled against you." Edward's breath caught in his throat. His heart thundered violently in his chest, and for a moment, he felt as though the air had been stolen from his lungs. His hands trembled as he ran them through his disheveled hair. The sickening reality crashed down upon him. He had forced himself upon an innocent woman. The very thought made him feel ill. His voice, now filled with pain and fury, erupted through the chamber. "Why did you not stop me? Why did you not protect her?" The guards flinched at his sudden outburst. One of them, hesitantly, offered an answer. "My prince, maidens are often hesitant their first time. It is common, but they grow used to it in time." A surge of rage unlike any he had felt before burned through Edward's veins. He slammed his fist against the wooden bedpost, the sharp crack of impact echoing in the chamber. "Get out," he ordered, his voice low and seething. The guards, though shaken, obeyed at once, bowing deeply before retreating from the chamber. As the door shut behind them, Edward sat in silence, his body rigid, his mind tormented. He had committed a grievous sin. Days passed, yet Prince Edward found no peace. He had vowed not to seek out the maiden, believing it best to leave the matter untouched, but his conscience tormented him without mercy. Each night, his sleep was plagued by dreadful visions, haunting recollections of that fateful night. He would wake in cold sweats, the echoes of the maiden's cries ringing in his ears. The burden weighed heavily upon his soul. Though he had commanded his guards to remain silent, especially before the king and queen, the truth clung to him like a shadow, refusing to be buried. The guards, fearing punishment for their negligence for allowing a strange woman into the prince's chambers, had readily agreed to his command, but even their silence could not erase what had transpired. Now, seated upon a grand feast spread in the lush green fields, Edward found himself facing his younger brother, Prince Gordon. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of ripened fruit and freshly baked bread, but Edward had little appetite. Servants stood at a respectful distance, tending to their needs, yet Edward barely acknowledged their presence. Gordon had been watching him closely, noting his solemn demeanor. At last, unable to contain his concern, he spoke. "Something is amiss, brother," Gordon said, his sharp gaze locked upon Edward. "You have been troubled since the night of the feast. You are not yourself. Speak to me, you know you can trust me." Edward did not wish to speak of it, yet the weight upon his chest grew unbearable. He longed for even the smallest relief from the torment that gnawed at him. At last he confessed, his voice low and grave. "I lay with a maiden that night." Gordon's eyes widened in shock. "By the heavens, Edward, I would never have expected such a thing from you. Was it your betrothed, Lady Eleanor?" "Of course not," Edward answered bitterly. "I do not even know who the maiden was, but I know it was not her." Gordon frowned, his brows knitting in confusion. "How can you not know her?" Edward exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "I was drunk," he admitted. "I am always careful with my drink, yet that night, I lost control. My memories are hazy, but I remember enough to know that she was not willing. I have wronged her, Gordon, and I must make it right." Gordon leaned back, studying his brother with a thoughtful expression. "Edward, I believe you are mistaken. You are the crown prince. Any maiden would consider it an honor to be your concubine. A woman who shares your bed, would not flee into the night. If anything, she would remain until morning, awaiting your recognition. She would boast of it to the entire kingdom. Edward shook his head. I thought so too, but I feel this maiden is different. Besides, I took her against her will. Perhaps she is angry.
Perhaps she fears me.
I must find her and make amends. Gordon sighed, rubbing his chin. Edward, listen to reason. If she wished to be found, she would have come forward by now. Perhaps she is married and does not wish to risk her household's ruin. She is not married, Edward said firmly. I took her maidenhood. Gordon hesitated before speaking again. Then perhaps she is betrothed. Maybe she fears the disgrace it would bring upon her intended. Edward clenched his jaw. If she is betrothed, then I must explain to her groom why she shall not be a virgin on their wedding night. I must take responsibility, Gordon. I have sinned against a woman's body, and my heart cannot bear it. Gordon studied his brother's face, seeing the anguish that clouded his eyes. He knew Edward to be a man of honor, a prince who held himself to the highest standards. The thought that he had caused harm to an innocent maiden must be tearing him apart. You are a good man, Edward, Gordon said at last, his voice softer. I know this troubles you greatly, but some matters are best left untouched. Edward did not answer at once. He merely stared into the distance. He knew one thing for certain. Until this matter was settled, he would never know peace. Prince Edward sighed heavily, rubbing his temples as the weight of his predicament bore down upon him. The more he thought of the maiden, the more restless he became. He had never struggled with guilt in this manner before. He had wronged a woman, and she was out there somewhere alone with the scars of that night. Edward, there were so many people at the feast, Gordon pointed out, leaning forward with curiosity. Ladies from different lands came to celebrate your return. How will you ever find out who she was? Edward exhaled, his gaze fixed upon the distant horizon. I have thought about that, and I do not believe she was from afar. She must be someone from this kingdom, he said with certainty. From what I have gathered, it could not have been one of the noble guests. The guard stated that by the time the maiden left my chambers, the feast had long ended, and all the noble families had departed to their guest houses. If it were a lady of noble birth, word of her absence would have spread across the court. But that never happened. No family raised concern, no noble daughter went missing from the celebration. Gordon considered this, nodding slowly. So, you believe she was one of our own? A commoner? A servant? Exactly. Gordon's brows furrowed. Brother, do you understand how many servants worked at the feast that night? It could have been a maid, a kitchen hand, a serving girl. There were hundreds of them. How do you intend to find the one you seek? Edward clenched his fists in frustration. I have no idea, he admitted. And worse still, how can I even begin to search without tipping off Mother? All the palace maids are answerable to her, and if she discovers that I was with a servant girl, she will not hesitate to punish her in the most horrid way. The queen was strict in upholding the purity of royal blood, and Edward knew that if she ever learned of this, the maiden's fate would be sealed before he could even offer her an apology. Just as the conversation fell into silence, Gordon suddenly sat up straighter, a spark of pride in his eyes. I have an idea. Edward turned to him with interest. At this point, I am open to any suggestion. Speak. This maiden, Gordon began, I know you did not see her face, but if you were to interact with her again, do you think you would recognize her? Edward thought for a moment before shaking his head. Gordon, I do not remember anything about her. I know, Gordon said, raising a hand to stop his brother. But think about it. How many palace servants would reject the crown prince? Is it not unusual that the maiden who shared your bed now hides from you? If you manage to recreate the scene of that night, I believe her reaction will betray her. Edward's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Gordon leaned closer, lowering his voice. I am suggesting that we recreate the circumstances of that night. You will be alone in a chamber with each and every serving girl who worked at the feast. You must observe them carefully. If the maiden was truly traumatized, she will not be able to hide it. The moment she finds herself enclosed in a room with you again, the wounds of that night will still be fresh. She will break down. She will cry. That is how you will know her. Edward felt sick to his stomach. His hands balled into fists, his breath coming quicker as he processed Gordon's words. "I feel like a monster," he murmured. "I cannot put her through that again. I cannot force her to relive that night. Do you have a better plan?" Gordon pressed. "Edward, the only thing that matters is finding her. Once you do, you can assure her that you would never have done such a thing in your right mind. You can show her that you regret it, that you seek to make amends. But we must find her first." Edward clenched his jaw. It was a cruel plan, but he could not deny that it made sense. He had no face to seek, no name to call. This might be the only way. "Even if I agreed," he said, "how do I get that many servant girls into my chambers without mother and father noticing?" Gordon smirked, his confidence unwavering. "Brother, have you forgotten? They will be away for a month traveling to the port to sign the trade treaty. They depart in 2 days. We will have enough time." Edward hesitated, uncertainty clawing at his conscience. "You must prepare yourself," Gordon continued. "I will find out the exact number of serving girls who worked that night and obtain a list of their names. By the time our parents leave, we will be ready." Edward exhaled, his mind warring with itself. He despised this plan. But if he wished to make things right, he had no choice. All that was left to do now was wait. There was a rumor spreading swiftly among the young servant girls in the palace. It was said that each of them would be granted an audience with the crown prince himself, summoned one by one to his private chambers. None knew the reason behind this peculiar request, but every maiden saw it as a rare opportunity, an honor to be in the presence of royalty, a chance to gain his favor. Whispers floated through the corridors, filling the air with anticipation. Perhaps the prince was lonely, seeking companionship before his marriage was arranged. No wedding date had been set yet, and many of the girls secretly hoped to win his affection. The line of hopeful maidens stretched long, each girl waiting nervously as the palace guards led them, one at a time, into the prince's guest chambers. Yet, each maiden who entered returned within mere moments, their faces portraying disappointment. Though the others saw how swiftly the others were dismissed, the remaining girls still clung to hope, believing their own encounter would be different. If anything, the swift rejections only fueled their determination. Each believed they themselves would be the chosen one. For Edward, the entire ordeal was proving to be a waste of time. The moment a girl stepped into his room, he knew instantly she was not the one he sought. Their reactions were all too similar. Some smiled boldly. Others tried to mask their excitement but failed, their cheeks flushing with eagerness. A few attempted to carry themselves with the grace of noble women, acting reserved and formal. Yet, none of them displayed any true fear. There was no hesitation, no dread, only admiration, awe, and one best shyness. He met them all in the same room that the events of that night transpired, but none of them seemed to even recognize the place. By the second day, Edward had grown weary of the whole affair. He no longer wished to continue this degrading task, but his younger brother, Prince Gordon, urged him to persist. He used the morning hours because the rest of the day was meant for his royal duties. And so, the maidens kept coming, one after the other, each leaving as swiftly as they had arrived. Just as Edward was about to put an end to it all, something changed. A maiden walked in, but unlike the others, she did not meet his gaze. Her hands trembled, and she struggled to speak, stammering as she tried to greet him. Edward's sharp gaze fixed upon her. Something was different about this one. There was fear in her eyes, real fear. His instincts told him that she was hiding something. He had seen so many faces in these past days, and he believed that if he saw the woman from that night, he would know. But this girl did not give him that feeling. And yet, before he could speak, the maiden suddenly broke into tears. Falling to her knees, she sobbed, "My prince, please have mercy. I did not do it of my own will. I was only following orders. I never wished to harm you, I swear it. Please spare me." Edward's brows furrowed. He had no idea what she was talking about, but he needed to find out. "Explain yourself," he commanded, his voice firm. Through her tears, she cried, "I was told to spike your drink on the night of the feast. I was told it was merely a sleeping potion, that you yourself had asked for it because you wished to rest. But I hid some of the herbs, and the next day, I took them to a herbalist in the village. He told me the truth. He said it was a drug that inflames a man's desires. Her voice trembled as she continued. My prince, I did not know. I swear it. I was threatened into silence. When I found out the truth, they said if I spoke, I would be accused of poisoning the crown prince. They said I would be executed. Edward's hands clenched at his sides. His tone was sharper now. Who threatened you? Who ordered you to do this? The maid swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. It was Lady Eleanor's handmaiden. She gave me the herbs and told me what to do. Everything fell into place in Edward's mind. How had he not realized it before? The loss of control, the strange haze that had clouded his thoughts that night, it had not been mere drunkenness. He prided himself on holding his liquor well. Someone had tampered with his drink, and because of one woman's wicked scheme, an innocent girl had paid the price. His voice softened. Do not be afraid. No harm shall come to you. You may leave in peace. I will speak of this to no one. The maid gasped in disbelief. She had expected harsh punishment, exile, or worse. Instead, the prince had spared her. Relief flooded her face as she bowed deeply before scurrying out of the room. Edward sat in silence, his mind racing. If she had poured the entire dose into his cup, he might have completely lost himself that night. He might never have even made it back to his chambers. In fact, there is no way he could have brought a woman to his chambers. He knows so much about herbal medicines, and he strongly believes with this drug, he must have even lost the ability to hold himself up, so perhaps someone brought him in. His first instinct was to confront Eleanor, but he pushed the thought aside. That was not his priority now. Besides, he did not wish to endanger the servant girl further. He summoned his guards and ordered them to tell him the whole truth, otherwise he won't spare them. That is when they revealed to him that they truthfully hadn't seen how he and the strange maiden got into the mansion that night since they themselves were intoxicated. Standing abruptly, Edward strode out of his chambers and called an end to the entire affair. He no longer wished to see any more maidens. He needed air. As he wandered the vast corridors of the palace, seeking clarity, he heard the hurried footsteps of Gordon approaching. Edward, his younger brother, called out, catching up to him. Why did you end the search so soon? We agreed to continue until noon. I am done, Edward replied shortly.
Done.
Gordon frowned. Then what now? What will you do? Edward exhaled, his thoughts swirling. I am not certain yet. But I believe I recall something from that night, something important. Gordon's curiosity piqued. What is it? Edward's gaze grew distant as he tried to summon the memory. A scent. Fresh spices mixed in the air. Gordon's brows lifted. The spice gardens? Edward nodded.
Yes.
I remember heading away from the palace that night, in the direction of the gardens. Without hesitation, the two set off toward the palace farms, hoping to retrace Edward's steps that night. At the farm, the moment the royal brothers arrived, the workers were thrown into a frenzy. Their presence was entirely unexpected, and without prior notice of an inspection, everyone scrambled to present themselves properly. The farmhands, covered in dirt, hurriedly wiped their hands and bowed low as the princes walked through the fields. A middle-aged woman, Beatrice, the wife of the farm overseer, rushed forward, her face flushed with urgency. She curtsied deeply, speaking with reverence. Your Majesties, the Crown Prince and the Royal Prince, I am most honored to have you here. She hesitated before continuing. We were not informed of an inspection, but we are more than willing to give the princes one. By now, a small crowd had gathered. The workers whispered amongst themselves, eager to know the reason behind the royals' unexpected visit. Gordon, always the more outspoken of the two, stepped forward. We are not here for an inspection. I would just like to ask you a few questions. Beatrice composed herself quickly, though an uneasy feeling settled in her chest. Of course, my prince. Please, this way. She led them into a private office, instructing the workers to take their break. Gordon wasted no time. From what we know, There was someone here in the gardens on the night of the feast a few days ago. Is that correct? Beatrice stiffened at the question, though she masked her reaction with a polite smile. The truth was, it would not be a great look if the royals discovered that she and her husband had left their own niece here, a maiden for that matter. It had been a rare opportunity to indulge in the lavish lifestyle of the palace, and since the guards knew them well, they had been allowed in without question. They had posed as royal guests. Yes, my prince, she finally answered, keeping her voice steady. Someone always stays behind to offer assistance if need be, especially on nights when the palace is busy with a grand occasion. She left out the part that such assistance was rarely ever required. The palace was always well-stocked, especially for celebrations. But rules were rules, and it was mandatory to leave someone behind in the gardens. Gordon's expression remained unreadable. Can you tell us who was here on the night of the feast? At this, Beatrice felt a sharp pang of unease. What had that troublesome girl done? Her mind raced. But Matilda never lied. She had promised that she had not gone anywhere that night, and that no one had seen her. My prince, it was one of my farm hands, Beatrice replied carefully. I hope they didn't offend the royal household in any way, she adds politely. This farmhand, was it a woman or a man? Gordon inquires, and Beatrice almost lost her breath. She was freaking out. My prince, we would never leave a maiden on the vast gardens all alone at night, especially on a grand royal night. She laughs nervously. It was a male farm hand, your highness. He is not stationed today, but I can have him report to you first thing tomorrow. Or, if you prefer, I can send some of the boys to fetch him from his house. Her heart pounded as she spoke, fearful of being caught in a lie. But to her relief, neither prince seemed to suspect anything. Edward had a feeling the farm hand might know something. He really wants to hear from him, but he didn't want to come off as desperate and suspicious, so he told Beatrice that there's no need to rush. The farm hand can come find them tomorrow. With that, he turned to leave. But instead of heading back to the palace, he strode deeper into the spice garden. Gordon followed closely behind. Edward inhaled deeply, letting the scent of the herbs and spices fill his senses. He wanted to feel that same familiar scent again. He needed to trigger his memory. They walked in silence, weaving through the narrow paths between the plants. But just as Edward was about to turn back, something, or rather, someone caught his eye. It was a maiden, far off in the gardens. He couldn't see her face, but he could hear her hum, a sweet melodic sound. Unlike other farmhands who were huddled in one place taking a break after their arrival and hurrying to pay respects to them, she was here, sitting in the gardens, working with precision. After a while, she grabbed her farm basket, stood up and turned around to face them. Their eyes met and they both froze. It's her, he whispered slowly, like he was in a trance. Matilda had been going about her work, in the middle of the spice gardens, her hands busy sorting through a fresh batch of spices, when she noticed the commotion among the workers. They whispered urgently, some rushing about. She frowned, her curiosity piqued. Her aunt and uncle were the heads of the farm, yet she received no privileges. She was treated as an outsider, a burden they carried out of duty. She was not even allowed to make friends. In her aunt's words, she was meant to be invisible. Her life revolved around working endlessly in the fields, only to return home and take on more chores. Ever since she had been forced to move to this kingdom after the death of her parents, she had known nothing but misery. Still clutching her basket of spices, Matilda stood up, brushing off the dirt from her skirt. She adjusted her clothes and smoothed down her hair before turning to leave. But the moment she lifted her head, she froze. Her body stiffened, her breath caught in her throat. The crown prince stood at a distance, watching her intensely. Every ounce of strength in her body failed her, and before she could stop herself, her legs buckled, and she fell back down into the spice plants, half hidden by the leaves. Her mind screamed at her. What had she just done? Instead of bowing in respect to the prince, she had collapsed onto the ground like a startled child. Matilda wanted to rise, wanted to apologize, but she could not move. Panic wrapped its icy fingers around her. What was he doing here? Had he come to find her? Did he recognize her? And if he did, what would he do to her now? 1,000 questions plague her mind, but she had no answers. Only fear. Gordon had never seen his brother so utterly frozen before. Edward, the ever-composed prince, stood rooted to the spot, his gaze locked on the trembling girl hidden beneath the spice plants. The shock in his eyes was unmistakable. Sensing an opportunity, Gordon made a move to step forward, intending to pull the girl out from her hiding place. But before he could take another step, Edward lifted a hand, silently commanding him to stop. Without a word, Edward turned and walked away, his mind too clouded with thoughts to linger any longer. Gordon hesitated, glancing once more at the girl before following his brother. The two princes strode through the farm in silence, neither speaking as they made their way back toward the main path. The air between them was heavy, charged with an unspoken understanding that something had just shifted, though neither could yet put it into words. Just as they neared the edge of the farm, the sound of hurried footsteps broke the quiet. A middle-aged woman, her breath labored from chasing after them, called out desperately, "Your Majesty, please wait." Edward and Gordon stopped, turning to face the woman as she caught up to them. Her face was lined with worry, but there was also a quiet determination in her eyes. She clutched the fabric of her skirt as she lowered her head in respect before speaking. "Your Majesty, I saw what happened. That girl, she is innocent. She is not from this kingdom and does not know our customs. Please, I beg you, do not punish her for disrespecting you." Edward studied the woman carefully. He and Gordon had never been particularly concerned with the kingdom's rigid rules on how commoners should address royalty. It mattered little to them. But what did matter was the strange effect this girl had on Edward. He needed to know more. His voice was steady when he spoke. "Old woman, I do not hold anything against that maiden. But tell me, who is she?" The woman exhaled in relief, her wrinkled face softening. "Her name is Matilda, Your Majesty. She is Madame Beatrice's niece, an orphan girl. She has no quarrel with anyone and is a very hard-working child." At this, Edward simply nodded, his expression unreadable. He did not ask any further questions, nor did he linger in the conversation. He merely offered a polite nod of gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply before turning to walk away, Gordon following close behind. But even as they left the farm, Edward's mind was elsewhere. Matilda. The name settled deep within him, unfamiliar yet strangely significant. Edward had spent the entire day buried in his royal duties, his mind occupied with matters of the kingdom. However, no matter how much he tried to focus, the memory of that night still lingered in the back of his mind. The next day, when Gordon came to share lunch with him, he wasted no time in bringing up the subject. "Brother, you've been quiet about our encounter with the girl at the farm. You said she was the one," Gordon inquired, his eyes searching Edward's face. Edward barely paused as he cut into his food. "I was wrong. How could I possibly know?" he dismissed, hoping to end the discussion there. But Gordon, as persistent as ever, leaned forward with an amused smirk.
"Exactly.
How could you possibly know, unless you test her?" Edward exhaled, placing his utensils down. "She is a young girl. Besides, I spoke to the young man who was at the farm that night. He swore that all the farm workers were in their home or serving at the party. He was the only one present." He resumed eating, making it clear that he wanted to drop the topic. Gordon studied his brother for a moment. "Does that mean you've given up on finding the girl?" Edward remained silent, his expression unreadable. Gordon leaned back, shaking his head with a knowing chuckle. "Brother, you are a crown prince. You cannot show weakness. People must not find out that you are one of the kindest men to ever exist. You need to be tough." Edward said nothing, but his grip on his fork tightened. "I know you feel guilty, but you must not show it," Gordon continued. "You are the strongest man I know. But this is the first time you've felt as though you have wronged someone this greatly. Even so, do not show guilt. That Matilda girl is the only one who has made you react in any way. That means something." He gave Edward a final glance before making his decision. "I will have her sent to your chambers this evening," he declares. Matilda's world shattered when a palace guard arrived at the farm to deliver a message. She had been summoned by the crown prince. She felt her entire body go numb. Her hands went cold. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. She couldn't run. Even if she tried, there was nowhere to go. Her aunt, Madame Beatrice, stood nearby, her gaze sharp and accusing. Though she said nothing, her expression was clear. Matilda knew she would suffer a severe beating later. The entire palace had whispered of the prince summoning servants to his private chambers, though no one knew why. However, never had a peasant with no identity been summoned before. Besides, they knew the prince was only summoning the unmarried maidens who worked at the party that night. This slave girl Matilda was not among them, so they were confused. The guard wasted no time. "Follow me." Matilda's legs felt like lead, each step heavier than the last, as she followed the guard out of the palace farms all through the grand corridors of the palace. Every step felt like a step toward her doom. And then they arrived. The guard led her to a large door, but it was not the guest chamber where the prince had previously attended to the other maidens. It was his private chamber. Matilda's heart pounded as she stepped inside. Matilda's chest rose and fell with frantic breaths, her heart thundering like a frightened fawn cornered in the dark. Her hands, frail and delicate, clasped one another as though they alone tethered her to this world. Her knees threatened to betray her, and only sheer will kept her upright. She dared not look up, dared not breathe too deeply. The chamber was quiet, so dreadfully quiet, that even her silence rang like a scream. A single presence loomed over it all. Prince Edward, cloaked in shadow, watched. Every other maiden had entered with smiles, curtsies, and flowery greetings. But not Matilda. She stood as though the very floor beneath her burned, her body trembling like a withered leaf in the autumn wind. Her innocence was painted all over her, like dew on morning grass, so pure, so untouched by the wickedness of court life. And yet, that same purity quivered now beneath fear's heavy shroud. "Look up at me." The sound of his voice was like the tolling of a bell, deep, commanding, impossible to disobey. She lifted her gaze, slowly, as though her eyes weighed the world. And when they met his, her soul seemed to lay bare. Terror. Raw, unfiltered, and unguarded. Tears shimmered in her eyes, like unspoken pleas. Her lips parted, trembling, but no words found voice. She tried to bow, her only offering of grace, but her body betrayed her. Her limbs were stiff, her throat parched, her heart pounding against her ribs like a prisoner seeking escape. Edward remained still. But within him, something stirred. He hadn't noticed, that she was trembling, that she stood on the edge of breaking. For he was too taken, enchanted,
bewitched by her.
By the maiden who dared not speak, who dared not breathe too loudly, yet stood before him more beautiful than any gem. Her lashes were wet with tears, her lips quivering like rose petals in the rain. Her skin glowed with fear's pale kiss, and yet he had never seen anything more divine. The air shifted as he moved toward her. She heard his footsteps approaching, like a predator encroaching on its prey. Her fear tripled. She began to kneel, looking for grounding, any support for her weak legs, but was frozen by his voice, remained standing upright. His words were firm, but not cruel. Still, she obeyed without question, lowering her head with humble grace. He neared her, close enough to feel the tremble of her breath, to smell the delicate spices in her hair. That scent, that same scent, etched in memory, embedded in dreams. His boots stopped before her. "Look into my eyes." And she did, and her soul shattered. Tears fell freely now, sobs rising from the depth of her innocence. Her frame shook, not from cold, but from a storm within, one born of fear, of confusion, of a past she couldn't escape. And in that moment, Prince Edward forgot who he was. He forgot the room, the walls, the world outside. There was only her, Matilda. Her beauty struck him, not with the flamboyance of courtesans, but with the quiet, aching splendor of untouched snow. He leaned in, almost unconsciously, breathing her in. And then she faltered. Her knees gave way. But before her body could touch the ground, his arms wrapped around her, strong and sure, catching her with ease. She was light, fragile, as though too much sorrow might break her apart. And when her sobs reached his ears, something inside him cracked. His trance broke. He released her instantly, stepping back as if her touch burned him. His eyes darkened, unreadable. He turned his face away. "Leave," he said, his voice cold, tight with something he couldn't name. And Matilda ran like a frightened doe, her feet barely touching the ground as she fled the room, her sobs trailing behind her like whispers in the dark. And Edward remained still, staring at the empty space she left behind. This time he was sure. It is her.